Something slightly different today, partly because I've got some new editing software, so I'm going to try and insert a few pictures into this video so you have more than simply me sitting here talking. But also because of this, the poppy I'm wearing today. It's coming up to the 11th of November, Armistice Day from the First World War that ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. And since then has been commemorated as the closest Sunday as Remembrance Sunday here in the UK and in most of the Commonwealth as well. And it's commemorated in other ways under different names elsewhere in other countries involved. It remains a big deal, a moment of solemnity, of remembering the huge losses of not just the First World War, but all that's happened ever since. And of course the symbol of the poppy, for those who don't know, for those from other countries, comes from the poppies in the fields of Flanders. And because the British Expeditionary Force, Britain's and the imperial commitment to the war on the Western Front was primarily in the northern sector from the Somme and further north, and often in Flanders and Belgium and this area, that was chosen because it was seen as particularly poignant, the little dots of red in the cornfields, in the wheat fields, that looked so much like blood and suggested that hint of the slaughter that had been going on. And it's still one of those things that I don't think anyone from this background who has much sense of history can look at a field dotted with poppies today and not feel rather sad. So I'm not today going to talk very much about that and about the modern commemoration. All these things are important, but this is of course a channel about history and about particularly the history of the ancient world and other periods where I've worked on. But I just thought it would be a good way into talking about how the Romans in particular and the Roman army of the imperial period commemorated those who fell in battle or those who fell in conflict and war. And it's interesting that here in Britain, this first major commemoration at a national level came because of the First World War, because of the First War where there was mass conscription and also widespread volunteering and a much larger commitment. It was the first time that Britain had really contributed, Britain and the Empire, you should always say, a major land army, not just an element that relied heavily on allies. Obviously allies were still very important in the Great War, but the sheer size of the BEF, particularly by late 1918, is bigger than anything else that Britain has ever committed to land warfare anywhere in the world, let alone on the continent of Europe. So it was something different, and the losses were different. Between them, Britain and the Empire lost something very close to 1 million dead. Now that's comparable to the losses in proportion to the population of the great struggle with revolutionary and Napoleonic France, but that was spread over 20 years and occurred at much more of a distance, and the population was that much smaller then. This was something that occurred in the era of moving pictures, of photographs, of letters arriving home very quickly, and shocked communities that had not in the main contributed to the small wars that Britain had been fighting for generations before that. So the Flanders poppy has stuck as the symbol for the charity, the Royal British Legion, that does so much to raise money to look after the widows, the families, those left behind by servicemen and women, but also those injured, those who suffer for the rest of their lives physically or psychologically as a result of their service in war on behalf of this country. And it's one of the most depressing facts of my life that I think is still true, that at no point in my life has there been a year when Britain's armed forces haven't been involved in conflict somewhere and have not suffered fatalities. So Flanders poppy is still there even when it's commemorating people who fell in the Second World War, in Korea, in all the many conflicts that have followed since then and sadly tend to be ongoing and given the nature of the world are likely to occur again in the future. This was brought home to me when back in 2008 I went on a battlefield tour of the sites of the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. And that's a hobby interest of mine, always been something that I've found interesting, both just because of the nature of the stories and its drama, but it's also from the point of view of a Romanist, it's looking at different military societies like the Zulus and how they operated, and how a British army relying on horse-drawn, ox-drawn, mule-drawn transport operated in the field. Maybe that helps us to understand better how the Romans might have faced up to similar problems. Now, during this trip, we visited Rorke's Drift, the site of the battle that I suppose has been made most famous by the 1960s film Zulu, which, if, like me, you grow up and live in Wales, is something very dear to your heart, apart from being a fine piece of cinema. And by the standards of movies, fairly accurate. There are lots of bits of license, but nevertheless, it's pretty good, because you can't really go into any sort of cinema film expecting too much in the way of historical accuracy, because that's not really what they're for. I mean, the more they have, the better, but those of us who would like to have every detail just right are bound to be disappointed in just about every case. But there, it was a tradition of the company who organised the tours that wherever they went to a site where British soldiers had fallen, they would lay a wreath of poppies as a memorial. And it was tempted to use words like nice, but it was a good touch. I think it was a thoughtful moment, a reminder that yes, we are hearing stories of these battles that can be very dramatic, but there was always a human cost. And I was asked to lay a wreath of poppies on the fairly recent Zulu memorial to the, estimates suggest 400 plus, perhaps even more Zulus who were killed in that fight on 22nd to 23rd of January 1879. And it was a solemn thing to do. And though, of course, you're taking a symbol from a war that in 1879 was yet to happen and would involve a completely different clash of industrialized nations against each other and slaughter on a scale appalling though the losses in the Zulu war were for both sides, nevertheless this would go into something far longer, far more ghastly in terms of scale, though individually it's hard to see much difference. Death is death in the end. And to the man who falls or who is injured for life, then a tiny skirmish that doesn't have a name or has a name no one ever heard of is as important as a big famous battle or a moment in history like D-Day, 6th of June 1944. But it was interesting to see how a symbol from a different conflict has been extended in popular imagination in a sense of what is right and what is proper, what is respectful, because that was the idea behind this, that not was simply to show that we were aware this was a tragedy of the human experience where men had come and fought each other and men had died on both sides. Regardless of the nature of the conflict, the cause of the conflict, that must make anyone sad. You know, inevitably, there's a sense of loss there. So that's just a little introduction to why I thought this was something worth talking about today. But let's turn to the Roman army. Now, you could look at all other aspects of ancient history. You could look about the Athenian tradition of the annual commemoration of those citizens who died in the past year. Most famously, Thucydides attributes to Pericles the great funeral oration, which doesn't just talk about those who'd fallen, but also the nature of Athens as a democracy and as a state, and contrasts it with its rival, its enemy of the time, Sparta. Greek traditions of burial of dead were different and varied depending on where the battle had occurred. In most cases, people were interred on the battlefield itself, and that's a tradition that has generally held true until fairly recently. They might bring Nelson back from Trafalgar, but they didn't bring the others who died there. Those were buried at sea, as was the custom. It's only been in recent years that you've had the British Army has started to bring back the remains of the fallen so that they can be interred here in Britain, whereas you can go to Flanders, to the battlefields of the First World War or the Second World War, and those little Commonwealth war grave cemeteries that are dotted around the globe, but look very neat, very tidy. They're presented in a very similar way wherever they are. And you have those rows of headstones. And if you go to the First World War sites, you will see the different style adopted by the Germans, adopted by the French, and also there's the Portuguese memorial, there's the one to soldiers of the Indian Army, as well that is done differently. And there are others, there are smaller ones in areas near hospitals where men who were wounded eventually succumbed to their injuries and were commemorated in a style that was felt appropriate locally. In the main, the Romans obviously are dealing with a situation, as with most people in the ancient world, that you don't have the ease of transport of today. So in the main, those who fell in battle were interred near where they died. It depended on, it was a major feature of negotiations after a Greek hoplite battle in the archaic and classical era. Part of admitting that you'd lost was going to the people who were left in possession of the battlefield and asking to be able to commemorate and to deal with the remains of your own fallen. So, you know, the victors would put up a monument, and also they'd have to be asked to get to permission to allow the losing side. And it was partly an admission that you'd lost, that you had to do this, that you weren't in control of the field and therefore not able to do it of your own free will and without asking anybody's permission at all. But there were differences between the way the Athenians and the Spartans commemorated their dead, and other cities as well. And that's a topic perhaps for another day. It's another big issue. For the Roman period, we don't know what happened to the dead in many of the battles in many eras. And I'm going to focus on the imperial period, the army of the Principate of the 1st, 2nd centuries AD, which is so visible archaeologically, and where we have large numbers of inscriptions. The epigraphic record is quite strong. In the earlier period, under the heyday of the Republic and those great conflicts with Carthage, with the successor kingdoms, with the Gauls, with the various peoples of the Spanish Peninsula, Ligurians and other in northern Italy, these long drawn out successive campaigns, people who fought in those and died in those didn't tend to be commemorated as soldiers because they were serving as citizens. By the time you have the professional army that's really sort of crystallizes under Augustus, then the army is much more distinct from society, and men are commemorated on tombstones as soldiers, sometimes with an inscription and a sculpture, a relief depicting the man in question, though normally these are done as, peacetime is probably the wrong expression for it, but the image is not one of warfare. So you quite often have soldiers just in a tunic and a belt and their boots and cloak, and perhaps carrying weapons, perhaps not. The most martial are the style of cavalry tombstone, where you have a cavalryman, often on a rearing horse, with a one or sometimes more naked or semi-naked barbarian cowering down in front of him. I mean, there's the one that was found not too long ago, where you have him, the trooper has actually beheaded his opponent. But that's as close as they get. In most cases, these don't show scenes of warfare. And also, very, very rarely do they give a cause of death for the man in question. So, in most cases, you will simply get unit, length of service, and age when the man died, so that you can calculate how long he'd been in the army on that basis. You can say his unit, you can say perhaps other aspects of his name, his place of origin, this sort of thing. Who commemorates him? Very often these are set up in accordance with a will, and sometimes they'll be by a family member, but perhaps more often by a comrade. And this is a celebration of a soldier's life and achievements. It often decorations, rank, these sorts of things are listed, but it doesn't say much more than that. And sometimes you will also have, this is a former soldier, served so many years, became a veteran, lived on, but still wanted to be commemorated as a veteran, as a former soldier, as someone who had served the empire, who had served the res publica. Any mention of a specific cause of death is rare. We have a man who was an optio ad spem from Chester who drowned, but losses in war are very rarely commemorated, or very rarely specifically listed. Now, there are probably several reasons for this. In the first place, we must remember that the inscriptions we have, the tombstones and memorials we have, are a tiny, tiny fraction of what once existed. So there were far more originally, and there were also plenty of men who probably were not commemorated with such a permanent monument, something in stone that had any chance of survival. There may well have been wooden or painted monuments. There is, for instance, a memorial of a wife to a prefect, her husband, who'd died in an attack by the Persians at Dura Europos, which was painted onto a wall. So there may have been specific spaces, or in the same way you can go around an old church today in Britain and in some other parts of the world, and you will see memorials put up by families to military people who've been killed on active service, or have died as a result of their service, or died subsequently, but still wish to be commemorated for that service and for their having belonged to a military force. So the number of people who are killed in war or battle that are specifically listed as such in the surviving epigraphic record is very, very small. I don't think it gets into double figures, specifically when you come to tombstones. You have some that are tantalizing. There is one from northwestern England where a man is described as having been killed by enemies in the camp. Now, it's very hard to know what that means. I mean, the easiest assumption is that there had been an attack by proper bona fide enemies, local tribesmen presumably, who had broken into the camp, and he had been killed in the fighting. On the other hand, you can imagine a darker element to this, where this is someone who has been killed, murdered, for whatever reason, by someone, person or persons, known or unknown, who are fellow soldiers, or at least are within that army base. We don't know. It's one of those things where you can't, just with the words, understand fully what was meant. However, I would say I think the natural assumption is that this was as a result of an attack, and therefore that would put this into the category of our war dead. Now, from Vindolanda, we have the tombstone of a man called Titus Annius, and those of you who've read the Vindolanda novel will know that I used him within the story. And he was interfectus in bello. The tombstone is fragmentary, but this bit of the reconstruction is very clear. And he was a centurion and serving in with or commanding a cohort of Tungrians. Now we know that there were Tungrians at the fort. The dating is probably Trajanic, perhaps early part of Hadrian's reign. People have tended to want to associate this with big wars mentioned in our sources. Now you can argue that there were perhaps only certain things that the Romans would consider to be a full-on bellum, a proper war, rather than fighting against latrones, lestae, bandits, raiders, even if they are not from within the empire. Maybe, but maybe that's getting a little bit too precise for this sort of the nature of a monument like this that is somewhere like Vindolanda on the fringes of the empire. Speculation is plausibly that this man was a legionary centurion, perhaps in command, temporary command of the cohort, because there was no equestrian prefect available or on the spot. But again, that's speculation. And it does seem to predate Hadrian's Wall, that's the most likely. So we are probably looking at that early period. Nevertheless, it's hard to know any more than that and exactly what happened. And I think I've mentioned this in one of the videos before. When I was writing Vindolanda, the novel, I didn't pay enough attention when I was taking notes, and I forgot that he actually has an heir, so that I, in the story, deliberately didn't have him with having a family and children, and then suddenly I had to create some explanation as to how this could happen by the next book. But this is a case where a Roman officer has been killed in the fighting, killed in a war, in a conflict. Presumably, it's not clear whether his body was at the site, although the inscription most naturally reads that. So perhaps he'd been brought back, perhaps he'd even died in the hospital of his wounds, or perhaps this is just a memorial, so it doesn't mark his grave, but it remembers him. We don't know any more details than that, and as I've talked about in other videos, particularly ones dealing with the background to the novels, we know so little about what's really going on in northern Britain at this time, and just why there is such a heavy military commitment on Rome's part, but also why they built Hadrian's Wall. You know, what's the reason behind all of this? It does suggest real or perceived threat. It does suggest actual conflict, at least some of the time. And there are hints in the sources of the heavy losses late in Trajan's reign of fighting under Hadrian. And various scholars have reconstructed that evidence in different ways to produce a different number of wars at different times. we can safely say there was a lot of conflict, there was a lot of campaigning going on, and Titus Annius was one of the men who fell during this conflict. Now, another case, again from Britain, is from Caerleon in South Wales, not far from where I live. This was Isca Silorum, the main depot, main base, the site of the fortress of Legio II Augusta for several centuries. Now, among the tombstones there is a rather interesting one, which is to a woman called Tadia Valorna, who died at the age of 65. But on the same stone, it commemorates a son, Tadius Exupertus, who died at the age 37, and he was defunctus expeditione Germanica, who died on an expedition to Germany. So this is when presumably he's a Second Augusta man, has been sent with a vexillation of the legion to Germany. Might mean the Rhineland, it might mean further south. Depends how specific they were in applying this, when again this is a family memorial. They're maybe not too concerned about precise geography, but more what do they think of? Where was it supposed to be going? So an expedition to Germany, and in this case, his remains are not here. The man is clearly has died there. He's defunctus there, but he's being remembered. This is a family group, and you clearly have a military family, because there's also a daughter mentioned, the dead soldier's sister, and she's setting this up to her mother. The deduction is there was probably a tombstone to the father as well, who presumably was a Second Augusta man, a veteran who retired, raised a family, and at least one son went into the army. So you have a reminder as well, and this is something we'll talk about much more in the future when we look at Roman army bases, forts and fortresses, and their military purpose, but also the communities that live in them and around them, and try better to understand what this army was like and what this world was like, because the Roman army was a reflection of that society. So you have here a case where it's clearly a memorial. This is not where the man fell. And we do have to remember that just as in Greek warfare and elsewhere, very often you would bury the dead on or very near to the battlefield, particularly if this is a battle fought in the summer heat of Greece. You don't want to transport these bodies too long. You don't want to keep them exposed to the air too long. You're either going to cremate them or bury them as quickly as you possibly can. With many of the fights in the Roman period, these would occur in places where it wasn't necessarily easy to retrieve the casualties, and it certainly wasn't easy to preserve corpses and transport them any substantial distance for cremation, for burial somewhere else, nearer the unit's base, nearer the family's home, whatever it might be. And we should remember there have only been fragmentary remains found there so far because of the nature of it, but obviously the Varan disaster in AD 9, where legions 17, 18 and 19 were destroyed, that is, I think, reasonably the Karlkreise site in Germany was certainly part of that battle, though perhaps the conflict spread over a wider area to, and that's the impression of Dio and the other sources. This is something that occurs over several days. But there, the Germanicus, the grandson of Augustus, went to the site with an army later and buried the remains of the Roman dead, who'd been left exposed to, first of all, whatever the victors chose to do to them, but then whatever scavengers and others had done in the meantime, and the elements. So it was a fairly confused set of remains that they were able to bury. And more recently, there's been that discovery of a cuirass of armour with the man still inside, the remains of the man still inside, that is associated with this big disaster. So very often, battlefield dead would be buried close to the scene of the fighting, because that was the only practical way to deal with it. Whether there was any tradition of putting up a memorial on the spot as a normal thing, or whether you relied on commemoration somewhere else, like Tadius Exupertus, is much, much harder to say. Germanicus did build a mound and a memorial over the dead that were buried at the Varan site. This was subsequently destroyed by the German tribesmen when the Roman army withdrew again, and the Romans didn't bother to go back and keep on building it. And that was a spectacular failure that had meant huge loss of life, the loss of 3 eagle standards, the major humiliation of the Romans, the loss of a province effectively, though in Germanicus' day maybe they didn't think that was permanent, and this was a major event, whereas lots of the fights in which the Roman army was involved was perhaps less dramatic, less famous, and whether they would choose to commemorate those is perhaps less likely. We don't hear a lot about the burial of the dead. There are some articles gathering together all the information. You could think of Crastinus, for instance, the centurion of Julius Caesar, who led a charge at the Battle of Pharsalus and was killed. And not Caesar's account, but it's emphasized elsewhere that he was buried with honors. But again, the Romans they don't generally give posthumous decorations. And another thing, of course, is that Roman monuments don't represent Roman dead. You represent enemy dead. You might represent Roman wounded occasionally. But on the whole, though there's an issue with this that we'll come to in a later video when I get around to scanning in my pictures of the monument in question, there might be an exception to all of that. But in the main, the Romans do not show their own losses, their own dead, on any of their memorials of war, which are obviously in the main memorials of victory. And of course that's fairly common. You will see with the various cenotaphs and things in Britain and elsewhere, there is likely to be, in some cases, a statue or relief of a soldier, of a sailor, of an airman, but you're not going to show, you don't show corpses. That would be distasteful, or considered to be distasteful. So you've got the Varan disaster, and of course one of the most famous memorials to someone who did die in battle is associated with that, and that's one, it's often shown because it's a good illustration of a senior centurion in his panoply with his decorations. This is the memorial to Marcus Caelius, a senior centurion of the 18th Legion who died aged 53, killed in the Varian War, the Bello Variano. There are also two freedmen. There are little busts on either side, as you can see in the picture, that show his freedmen. Perhaps they were all his household or all his attendants who were with him, or certainly the ones considered worth commemorating. And this memorial is set up by his brother, and explicitly it says that if his bones are found or if his remains are found, they could be interred here. But of course he perished in a disaster that's now outside the empire because you've abandoned the province, and no one was there to collect the dead, to find them and to commemorate them properly. So this is very much, again, a memorial like the one to the soldier defunctus in the expedition to Germany, but in this case it's more specifically associated with one incident that is listed, but it's a way of remembering the man, the way of honouring the man, and to an extent his two freedmen as well. But it's another reminder of how the Romans are dealing with, in this case, a serious defeat and the men who died with them in that defeat. So it is still quite proper, as far as the Romans are concerned, to commemorate someone who dies in a defeat. It's because, again, the Roman assumption will be that in the long run we'll get them back and we'll win. But also, of course, it's just a reminder, as with the sister commemorating her mother and her brother on the same monument. The mother's buried there, or her remains are, the brother is not. These are real families with real emotions, real people, and they want to mark their sense of loss, but also their sense of honour, of respect for the individual and their achievements. Tadius Exupetus is not really, nothing is added to the inscription to tell us very much about him, what rank he held, any details like that, whereas you have the very martial Marcus Caelius. He is there in uniform, in his body armour, bareheaded, but he has the different decorations on the harness over his cuirass. His rank is given, his legion is given, and that he died in the war. So that very clearly is a memorial to an officer who has fallen in the line of duty. But again, I've already gone through 3 or 4 memorials to men killed, and we're starting to run out. There are very, very few. Most memorials simply don't say when and how the man died. There is something else that is more like a modern cenotaph memorial, these sort of monuments that will be centerpieces for acts of commemoration and remembrance over the weekend to come, both on the 11th and particularly on Remembrance Sunday. And this is what's known as the cenotaph at Troipium Traiani, Adamclisi in modern-day Romania. Now, it's one of several monuments, and we're going to talk in a future video about the metopes, the sculpted reliefs that surrounded the big drum-shaped tropaeum itself. And we're going to try and look at that because they tell us all sorts of interesting things about the Roman army. And when we look at that, we'll talk far more about the context of these monuments and just what they're commemorating, whether it's a specific battle and if so, when, and what story is behind them, but also other possibilities. Now, we'll come back to that a little bit, but sadly, most of this particular cenotaph monument has been lost. We have a few fragments of something that people have estimated about 16 meters square. It was a large, substantial square monument with names listed on it of Roman soldiers, the bravest men who died for the Republic. Memoriam fortissimum pro Republica morte Arcuberint, sorry, I'm getting all caught up at the moment. My voice isn't that great after a rather nasty cold. Now, the first name on the monument of the most senior officer at Praefectus is lost. It does, however, say to us that this man was born in Pompeii, but resident in Naples, which does very clearly date it to someone who's born before the eruption of Vesuvius, but who has survived that or wasn't there at the time, and he and his household have now moved to nearby Neapolis, Naples, instead of the now destroyed Pompeii. There then appear to be, it looks as if this was done with senior men first, then legionaries, then auxiliaries. However, very, very few of the names can be read at all. And one of the original scholars to study the monument suggested that there was space for up to 3,800 names on this monument of these men, these bravest men who fell in battle for the Republic. Now, 3,800 is probably a good rule of thumb maximum for how many might have been on the monument, but that would imply that the space was organized in such a way that every inch was used, and that there was no, because of the division between rank, between arm of the service, between the legions and the auxilia, and then there's at least one, there's a cohort of Batavians are listed there, though there are men listed from other auxiliary units and we don't know where they're from. There are legionaries listed, we don't know whether they were grouped by legion or simply because they were citizens, by name, by the place of origin. All of which they're three, they get the full trionomina, the three Roman names, whereas the auxiliaries don't. But the auxiliaries get their place of origin. And one interesting feature of one of the surviving fragments, again, it relies on reconstruction, is that one of the men in what looks like an auxiliary cohort, is not named, was actually a Briton. So this might be the first surviving formal memorial to a named soldier from at least the province of Britain, whether he was a Briton as we might understand the term and as the Romans would, of someone who was a descendant of the tribes, the indigenous Iron Age people, or whether he's someone whose family had moved there and ended up joining the Roman army. This is probably around about the end of the 1st century, start of the 2nd century AD. There's certainly aspects of the monument complex are Trajanic, as is the foundation of the colony there, or refoundation of the colony there. So the reason there is this collection of monuments there, but it's possible that at least some of the monuments or the early stuff are associated with Domitian and his war against the Dacians, or wars. So it could be slightly earlier, but that's the era we're dealing with, which means Britain's only invaded in AD 43. It's still, that invasion is just about within living memory when this chap is serving in the Roman army and falls. So that's an interesting thing. But of course we know from other sources that they had begun recruiting full units of Britons. But this chap, given that he's next to men who have different origins, it might be that he was just serving in an auxiliary unit that was not specifically associated with Britain in any way, or the Britons, was not even overtly recruited from Britons. But that's quite interesting. So this is a case where we do have a monument that originally listed large numbers of Roman soldiers of all ranks, up to quite senior ones, who died on behalf of the Republic in a conflict. So these are war dead, remembered in a way that strikes us as similar to the war memorials that you will have in many towns, in churches, that they will list people from this parish, from this area. And again, you can think, if you look at those in Britain, you will often see nearly all were built in the 1920s or first set up there, but then they had to be modified where possible to include dead from the Second World War as well. So you get a monument being reused in that sense, or expanded. Quite what happened here, we simply don't have enough of the monument surviving and intelligible to really go into any sort of detail about just how it all worked and how full of names it was. But it is a reminder that the Romans could, and in this occasion certainly did, commemorate the dead of an army, the dead of the legions and the auxilia of all ranks who'd fallen in war, who'd fallen in battle, or at least died during the course of the conflict. It assumes from the inscription there they are people who died in action, but again, how the army chose to interpret that at the time is very hard to say. It's logical to presume this was not a unique monument, that there were others of a similar nature, and that this sort of commemoration was done by units, by provincial armies, by order of the emperor, at various times in various places, because it matters to the soldiers that they're not dying for nothing in a sense. There is that morale element whereby you wish to feel valued, and you wish to show that even though you have paid the ultimate sacrifice, that you are still valued, you are still remembered. And in a military sense, there may also be an element of corporate identity. You know, this is a reminder of, excuse me, what past generations of your cohort, your legion, have done, and the price they have paid, and that similar bravery, you know, you are also to be the next generation. You have to live up to this. You are to be the bravest as well. So there can be a whole range of emotions that are not mutually exclusive at all that come together in this, because this effectively seems to be a set of monuments built by the Roman army for the Roman army. There was a civilian community around the garrison as well, but it's not its primary focus. So you have this list, and it is interesting that they've bothered to list not simply the legionaries are marked out, they are shown as Roman citizens, they get the trianomina, which the auxiliaries do not, but they have still bothered to list the auxiliaries by name and by their place of origin. This mattered to the officialdom of the army, and they had that information, but also to the people who are expected to pass by this, to perhaps commemorate this, the dead there at regular intervals, annually, whatever it might be, in a similar way to the way commemorations would work in the modern era. So here's a glimpse of a Roman army that in some ways is doing things very differently. You know, you have the altar nearby, you have places for sacrifice, you have statues of chained captives, things we would not be inclined to add to a memorial now, but nevertheless the fact that they're doing it is something that is relatable, or at least appears to be relatable. So that's a little survey of Roman commemorations of war dead by the army of the Principate. I will talk more about this set of monuments and about the information, and we'll also talk more about the battle and the nature of, is this a commemoration of the losses in one action, as many scholars have assumed, or do the numbers suggest that's probably rather too many unless this was quite a substantial disaster? Is this commemoration of all the men who died in a campaign, in a war, or perhaps all the men from the army of this province that died in that campaign or war? We don't have enough information to be able to decide that. So this has not been an attempt to say Roman history is more important or to divorce it, or in any way to downplay the symbolism of this, and particularly the charitable concerns of this. There is a good reason for remembering the human cost of war, because hard though that is to see in the modern world, the hope is that we can avoid having wars in the future, but also to look after those who are left behind, whether dealing with the cost of conflict in mind and body, or the loss of the fathers, the husbands, these days the wives and mothers as well, who have paid that price and who have been sent by the state to do a job and have not come back. So all of these issues are a reminder that the Romans are just people. They're like us, and they could have the moments where they wish to commemorate the dead, and some of these monuments are intensely personal. They're family memorials, and some are more official, but that doesn't mean this isn't a very personal thing to the units and soldiers concerned, particularly the men who are building this, who are probably ones who served alongside men whose names are carved on that memorial, so know them as more than a name, or remember them as more than simply a name. So that's just a little introduction to something from the modern world, but how it helps us to look back and focus our attention on an aspect of life in the Roman Empire and of how the Roman army worked and operated and thought about itself.